So now we're on. I have on my show All That Jazz tonight, Cameron. Welcome, Cameron. So we had met years ago in the hostel, and I remember,
Scotland, Edinburgh,
yes, in Edinburgh, Scotland,
in
Scotland,
a
and
church. Huh.
yes, and we had some. I remember we had some debates there, but and then years later, you contact me and you said that you had a change of mind. So
Mm,
can you walk us through what happened? Because I'm
mm.
curious.
Well, when we met, I was pretty strongly left left wing minded. I was I suppose I was convinced of the idea that there's a moral element to to basically the left wing versus the right wing, and that to be left wing was essentially to be more moral because it implied that you cared more about other people because you wanted, which is probably not totally far off. Um, but I suppose what happened was that well, you introduced me to some people. You introduced me to what was his name again? The dude with the awesome Boston accent.
Boston. He's from New York. Thomas
Okay,
Sowell. Thomas
Thomas
Sowell.
Sowell.
Yeah.
Um, and so I read him. I also got quite far into history and saw more of where the roots, how our society and our economic systems were founded, and
Right.
that they were the idea of competition and the idea of competition and individualism wasn't something that happened naturally.
Mhm.
It took a long time. It took some force, and it's something to be proud of. And that it's not in any sense really immoral. And that even though there's a temptation for people who are more empathetic to look at the way the world works and say there must be a way to make this more egalitarian, to uh,
More
diminuate
fair.
suffering, more fair,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, I think most of the constructions that people come up with to do that end up being making things worse, basically, and that the organizations and the systems of organization that we've come up with have taken a long time with thousands of years of tinkering and of actual general improvement,
Mm-hmm.
um, and have gotten to a way in which they leave everybody pretty well off.
Right. So,
Um, yeah,
sorry, what was the basic assumption then that the socialist or the communist system was going to be better for everybody? That collectivism is
mm,
better,
and more empathetic.
empathetic. Yeah.
Mm, because
So,
yeah, you know,
so it's the intention versus so it's
mm,
like putting the intention on the pedestal, saying the intention is
mm,
paramount. The intention is
yeah,
because if
yeah,
the intention is good, then the results must be good.
yeah,
But
exactly,
then you
yeah,
found that that's not always the case, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly. And having the intention is perfectly admirable, but it takes almost a certain uh, amount of intellectual honesty, even coldness, to go and look at how the institutions we have were formed, and to
Mm-hmm.
say, you know, this is an ideal in a lot of ways. It's not bad to make small tinkering adjustments to try to improve things,
Mm-hmm.
but having some giant revolution, uh, I mean, it's like Will Durant said, revolution. The only thing revolution equalizes is poverty. You know,
Right.
it's it's the speed in which you do it as well. I think, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and that's, I think, a little bit. It's a sad realization in a certain sense, for people who want there to be want the sort of prosperity that most of the world enjoys to be spread more evenly. I
Right.
think that,
So
but
it's
in
not
reality, you can't force that so easily. You
right,
know.
right. It's not so easy. Like people a lot of time focus on why certain countries are poor, but I think there should
Mm.
be more focus on why certain countries are doing so well
Yeah,
and try to
yeah, yeah. I
emulate
agree.
that, right? Instead of
Yeah, absolutely.
demonizing it as in as in that they're taking advantage of the as if America got where it's were, but taking advantage of others, which is a very, I would say, very skewed viewpoint to say the least. You know what I mean?
But that's also not to say that they didn't take advantage of others and didn't do things that were a little bit, immoral. The same
Sure.
thing with the British Empire,
What country didn't? There's
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's like, and you can focus on that, and sure, it's a good thing to focus on that to a certain extent. But like you say, like, what are we doing well that's working?
yes.
I think those questions, I think, end up coming with age more than anything as well.
Yeah. Is
But I
it
think it's just,
like is?
don't you think?
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say it seems to be something of our generation and something that seemed to start, especially in the 1900s, where any sense of traditionalism and any sense of respecting and thinking, wow, okay, we've gotten this far. Look how rich we are at this point.
Yeah.
From slowly making improvements and tinkering on what we've done before, that way of approaching things seems to just be wiped off the map. And you can see it in art around 1900, in art and in literature. There's this whole destruction of order that took place and a replacement with a pure concentration on rebellion and doing something that's new. And I don't know what happened there. It's a funny thing. It came at the same time as as the massive advance in science and all that sort of stuff. The whole world changed very quickly,
Yeah.
and that's essentially what modernism became and still is for people, and especially young people. It's not about looking back and saying, well, the former generation did it like this. We can tinker and we can improve. Suddenly, the most valued thing in art and in like political theory possibly as well was down with tradition. Let's destroy everything that came before and let's just like paint circles and
Yeah. Did you see
abstract.
the painting? There was a painting the other day that I saw. I don't know if this is true, but there was only two colors and it sold for 45,000 euros
Oh, really?
or even
That's
more.
ridiculous. Right? Yeah, it's the
I saw
that's that's
that's
especially
maybe
funny.
the culture right now.
That's the domination as well of an aristocracy, which is the ironic thing, is because there's essentially a group of very like privileged, intense intellectuals who sort of work within the schools, the art schools, and sort of set the mode for the prices almost. They're the ones sort of saying, this is in at the moment. This is what we like at the moment.
right.
And they affect massively. There's pretty much it's not a small group of people, but it's an aristocratic group of intellectuals who decide what is and what is and what isn't valuable in the art world.
Right.
It's
But
weird,
don't you
man.
think the
The art
general
world's
public?
weird and ironic.
But don't you think the general public is in some way influenced by? Because they're the ones also dictating the what sells in art and also,
Mm.
but I guess they're also influenced by the popular maybe postmodernistic art kind of movement. Because a
Mm.
lot of
But that's all the schools, all of the art schools are postmodernist now. There's very few art
there
schools
we
that you can
go.
go to and learn how to do anything traditional.
Do you know
Partly
why
because
that
I guess
is?
we started taking photographs. I mean, that's the generally, like, if you go to an art history class, they'll
Right,
tell you, well, once we figured out that we can take photographs, everyone was like, well, there's no point in painting something that's literally there anymore.
right.
Again, there's nothing wrong with. I mean, I love abstract art, and it can be really stimulating. It can be humorous. It can be excellent. But this general total destruction of order, and it's really order and traditionalism in
Right.
art and
That's
culture is weird, man. It's unheard of.
it
Nothing.
seems like today to be a rebel is to be a traditionalist, to be
Mm,
religious, to be kind of
yeah,
conservative, to be
yeah, totally.
to vote
It's ironic, man.
conservative, and everybody will look down upon you and say, "Oh, you're such a degenerate. You're an old generation. You're a
Mm,
dinosaur. You have nothing." But
mm,
actually, that is you are preserving something that's good of the culture.
mm,
Don't you agree that?
mm,
Because
mm,
if you want to just break down everything, then it's man,
mm.
what are we doing? What are we doing? We're
Yeah,
breaking
yeah,
down something that's working, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
I
Well, and
want to
that
go
sort of
back to something that sorry, did you want to say something?
I was going to say that's essentially what postmodernism is.
Yeah,
Funnily
yeah.
enough,
Now we're right.
postmodernism is the flip, and so okay. Now that we've destroyed any sense of traditionalism and order, what do we do now? Like maybe we should make some things that are a bit tidier and follow a certain pattern again. And
Yeah.
it's like, well,
You you know that
it's pretty funny.
reminds me.
It's
I
cool.
was watching YouTube the other day, and there was somebody was interviewing Australian guy was interviewing people in Australia, just like early '80s, and somebody commented and said, "Oh, the dressing, the style has returned. Like what they were wearing in the early '80s in Australia, the style
All
even
right,
in America, that's returning now.
come on.
The hairstyle
All
and all."
right, okay. We're
I don't
going
know if
back to the
that's entirely
70s
true,
again.
but there is something to
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
There is cycles
Cyclical.
that repeat. But
Yeah, but this one's odd, I think. I think this whole thing, I think the last century is going to be seen as something really, really strange in the future. You know, this
right,
sort of starting in the 1900s and then, Europe being and the whole world being plunged into these enormous wars, um, and this total destruction and change. I mean, it's like, when you go digging, or you have archaeologists digging around in like Crete or something like that, or in
right,
Greece, and they're like, oh wow, suddenly, in between 2,000 and 2,400 years ago, the pottery changed, and you start seeing these nice circles around them. If anybody ever gets their hands on what we were doing in this period of time, they're going to be like,
right.
what the hell happened in 1900? Like
But
chaos.
the technology makes everything go faster. But I want to go back
Yeah.
to the Thomas Sowell and all that, because I remember some of the conversation we had earlier. I you seem to remember we had a conversation about religion. I don't remember the conversation about religion when we talked yesterday, but I
A little
remember
bit. Yeah.
I remember that we had a conversation about something political, and you were like berating some people and berating the rich or whatever it was, and I was like, man, there's just like resentment talking. I remember something like that. That's about the only bit
Yeah.
I do remember strongly, because it was
Yeah. Yeah.
but to be fair, I tend to sometimes argue with a very kind of emotion as well. But you were kind of
Yeah.
you were
Yeah. Yeah.
feeding
We all
back
do
as
that.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Um,
So do you think
yeah.
there is let me see how I ask this. Do you think people's political view is sometimes based on their emotional state in life, their spiritual state almost?
Mm, yeah. Totally. Yeah. And their location and their community and what they're going through at the time. Yeah, and especially the emotional state thing. And I think that's what makes it so difficult um, to to change your mind about anything when you get attached to a set of ideas. Is
Yeah.
that it's difficult to remove yourself and to think objectively about anything, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
um, and I think that's why it's like sort of what we're talking about is kind of what does it take to change a person's mind? Because that's, I think, what you found, why we're talking now, what you find interesting about this change that I had going essentially from being,
Yes.
and it's not that I don't have any sympathies left, I still sometimes on the fence, between, you know, this socialistic mindset of what we can we do um, to make things more egalitarian,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that people, and I still see that as I still see the point in that. I think there's a middle line that you can follow where each issue essentially has to be taken uh, on its own, um,
Right. But
and there
that's
are
a more
certain
radical
things with
position
but I,
than
but I think
saying
radical.
everybody, the rich has to give their money, they're all bad and all, kind of
Mm.
a Marxist kind of
Yeah,
argument, which is
I
the
mean, I totally was like that. I forget now.
yeah, I
I used to
just remember
spit.
a little
I
bit,
used to
but
spit on fancy cars. If I saw a nice car, I'd spit on it because it
really,
just pissed me off that somebody would spend $200,000 on a essentially like a statement of their own worth. Like it's
it it
you know
offended your sensibilities. You were like,
it offended my sensibilities. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
you're like,
I was pretty radical at the time. I was like, I don't know. You were sort of the same one. You were traveling around with not a hell of a lot of possessions.
no, yeah. I
Living
mean,
pretty.
the problem with if I espouse any right-wing stuff, which sometimes do, that people accuse me that I live my life as a left-wing guy, but then I have
Yeah.
but then my argument is, well, you can say, you can be part of the system, but still espouse to something that I think would be better for the majority of people. You see?
Mm, mm. Man, yeah, there are people like full on the dole for 20 years who are flat libertarians who think the dole shouldn't exist.
Well, I'm not like that, but I've
Yeah,
not heard of that
you meet
case.
people like that. It's
Yeah.
funny, Yeah, there's a certain amount though. Once you're inside, once you're inside a system, you've got to play by its rules, whether you like it or not. Still, I think you got to watch hypocrisy like that to a certain
Yeah.
extent. But I don't think you're an example of hypocrisy.
Well, I
But it
kind
is
of live frugally. I didn't have much possessions, and that doesn't mean like I wasn't living off the government. I was working here and there, in a
yeah,
hostel,
yeah.
you
That's
know.
not living a left wing life, or that's not living a like that's just being non-materialist. That's a different spectrum entirely, isn't it? Materialism versus
Okay. To
non-materialism.
to to be fair, I last year I did go to a college that was paid for by the Scottish government, so I have to like
Lucky.
full disclosure. there is, there is like,
Lucky.
but I'm like, people argue that conservatives are selfish, and that
Mm,
you could say that was a I'm taking advantage of the system in a way because it's
mm,
there.
mm, mm, mm.
Anyway,
Yeah, but this conservatives are selfish thing. It's the same thing. It's that motive argument from people who think that by having a set of by following the set of ideas, which is in a sense usually more intellectual, more
mhm.
practical. You know, the arguments for it tend to be slightly more complicated and less idealistic. You
Right.
know,
Is that what it is? Do you think that the left, I mean, okay, let's say the far left, the Marxist, let's say, then they tend to more argue with emotion, with
yeah,
idealism.
I think so. Pretty hard to see how somebody could still be a Marxist if they were arguing intellectually. I mean, it's Marx's economic system just done work. We figured that out pretty fast. He was a terrible economist, and then
Yeah, but that is not. But
it's
I've had professors at the college that I attended that are, have high education. I would say they're very
mm,
smart people. Intellectually, they're very high intellect, but still they're Marxist. Like they support Marxism.
like
How?
pure old-fashioned Marxism.
It depends on the person, I guess. But I'm not gonna call any names out. But
No.
you all know who you are. um,
Socialism, like understandable, but Marxism, like man, I get it kind of. I mean, you can understand it in the context of the 1840s in Britain, where people are literally like living and sleeping in factories. Most of London is basically a ghetto. I mean, and
yeah,
something radical had to be done. Uh, in the end, what solved it wasn't a lot of radical thinking. It was again incremental change.
right.
Um, but
The,
you can see how people would think about that during the Industrial Revolution. But it was pretty clear, I think, to a lot of people, even at the same time that Marx was around. Like socialism, you know, we've sort of learned from socialism. We've implied all these, or we've employed all these socialistic elements into how we manage our society, like university and education being paid for. The idea that if you're born into a community which just sucks, and your mom and dad are useless,
mm-hmm,
and you are, as an individual put in a position where it's not going to be easy to make your life better or nicer than it was when it started.
mm-hmm.
One of the best things you can do is if there's a pathway created by the state for people in that position. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue that that's a bad thing, right?
Yeah. Well,
For example, access to education.
right. I'm kind of utilitarian in that view. I don't know. Did we talk about for example, the U.S. Provides a lot of loans for colleges and all that, but then the colleges use that to inflate the price because they already have a small
Yeah,
guarantee, and then they inflate the
yeah,
price. I don't know what
yeah.
the solution in that case would be. I don't
Yeah.
know, because you
Well,
can.
it's this is the minute details. Sort of like I was saying, it's like
Yeah, it's
there's it's hard not to want to make sweeping statements and say like, yeah, this is it, the revolution, we're going to solve it like this. But in reality, society is extremely complicated, and each individual thing needs to be dealt with slowly and one by one.
okay.
And in some countries, it's been done really well. In some countries, I mean, obviously, the US is not dealing well with education. I mean, that's
Right,
the cost them
right.
$1,000
A
by
lot
the
of
time they
people would
finish.
say that that is because there is no choice. That I don't know if you know, in U.S. they sign people. If you live in a certain county, that you have to go to that public school, and you can't go to other schools. And in some places, they even have lotteries for people to have the chance to go to what they call a charter school, which is basically a very kind of there's a private school, but it's financed by public money sometimes. But they have lotteries because there's limited places, because they don't want everybody to have those opportunities, I
Because
guess.
they want competition. They want to be a desired
Unions,
location to
school
study.
unions, teachers
Mm,
union are against it. So but
mm,
again, it becomes political, because anytime
mm.
you have a big I think a big government agency or a big union, they want to first of all protect themselves, and that's the problem. Once something grows, once you start a government program,
Yeah,
it has its own incentives, and it wants to survive,
yeah,
it
yeah.
wants to grow bigger. And that to me is like that to me is the crust of Thomas Sowell work, because he studies
Mm,
that and he sees
mm.
unintended consequence. You have
Yeah, okay.
US, the war of poverty, and Lyndon Johnson start something that everybody would say is good, but then the
Mm,
results are actually the
mm,
opposite. You know,
mm,
it creates
yeah,
more poverty.
yeah,
And I'm like,
totally. Because it's
oh,
hard to mess with a system that's that complicated. Yeah, I'm with you there. That I think is sort of the crust of conservatism in a sense. That's the point of it. It's like uh, looking at what people have done before to see what's worked, and then only ever implementing very, very careful, very, very slow changes to the system, just because
right,
you just cannot know with something as complicated as a society of, like America with what, 350 million people,
yes,
uh,
almost
all
350.
the
Wow.
all autonomous people trying to get the most out of their own individual worlds. You can't just throw something in there and be like, "Yep, rehaul. Let's see what happens." You have no idea what's going to happen. You know?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's the.
it's a big problem. It's a big problem.
Mm,
Um, okay, so you mentioned also Will Durant, and that's one of your influences as well. Can you
mm.
talk a bit
Um,
about Will Durant? I don't know anything about Will, so
Cool. Okay, I'm obsessed with Will Durant. Will Durant
okay.
is a he's um he's a historian. He was born, I think, in the 1890s, like late 1800s.
Hmm.
He um he was initially a socialist, I think, as a young man, um, and he he went and studied history. He was a teacher, uh, and eventually got his doctorate and blah blah blah, and started. His first book was a history of philosophy, um, but it wasn't a rigorous explanation of. I mean, it could be fairly rigorous, but wasn't a rigorous explanation of each historian's set of ideas. You can't do a whole history of the world, of Western philosophy in one book
Right,
and go too depth. It
right.
was more focusing on um, the the situation that the person was in, the history, the soil that grew the person, and then going somewhat into what the ideas were and how that
Hmm.
influenced people at the time. It's a really holistic view of philosophy. Bertrand Russell, the English historian, read his book and then wrote his book, The History of Western Philosophy, which is like the staple now from my understanding, for most philosophy degrees. Um, so he did that, and then he started the money he got from that. He started using. Well, first he fell in love with a pupil of his at one of his like schools, which is like kind of like the inverse. He pulled an inverse Macron, um,
An inverse
and
Macron.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think
The
that's
Prime
what that
Minister
the technical
of
term.
France, Macron. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he's with he was like the older lady. Click with her, good old Bridget. This
Right,
this is the inverse, an inverse
right,
Macron.
right, right. So Durant was where was he the professor?
Um, I can't remember.
Okay.
He moved around a bit. He was that wasn't even a professor. That was teaching in like a in a high school before he
Oh,
finished
okay, okay, okay,
doctorate.
okay.
And then he started. I don't think he did take some professorships, but he more did. By the time that stuff was happening, he'd already had the success with the
Wait,
first
wait.
book.
He got with somebody in the high school, so she was
Oh
really
yeah,
young.
yeah,
Uh,
man. I told you it's a reverse Macron. Yeah, yeah. She was young, so you'd think that's creepy,
wait,
but
younger
then
than
but then
18.
yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, I think
Oh
so.
my
I assume
gosh.
they were careful and organized things properly. That's Ariel Durant. But I mean, Ariel Durant ended up. I mean, they stayed together until they died. You know, like in fact, and she wound up contributing enormously to the work. The books are by Will and Ariel Durant.
Right.
It's not just you know. She wrote a lot of it. She was ended up doing it brilliant. You know, and by the time he passed away, it was like I think he got sick. I think they both got sick at a similar time, and he she died first, and then upon hearing the news, he just went zip. He just died as well. He kind of, you
Really
know, no will to. It's a
heartbroken.
gorgeous. Yeah, he just
Heartbroken
wasn't.
and just
They were,
will to live.
yeah, totally adjusted to living together. They just became like what do you call it? Like a society of two or something like that. It's pretty cute.
Right.
So anyway, he he after he wrote the history of Western philosophy, it's actually called the story of philosophy because it's written in prose, you know, beautiful prose. I mean, I think some of the best prose written in English.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's personality in these books and stuff like that. It's excellent. It's the same thing with Bertrand Russell's history of Western philosophy. These aren't. It is aiming at giving you a independent, a objective viewpoint, but there's personality in there as well.
Right, right. Of
But
course,
Bertrand
everybody needs their
Russell's
mark.
Bertrand Russell pretty much writes a whole screw Nietzsche section. Like, you know, like he's not being that objective at all. But
Right, right, right. S- So
so
you would say
I'll
Durant was your influence, Thomas Sowell and Bernard Russell?
Bertrand Russell.
Yeah.
Um, Will Durant ended up writing the history of civilization, the story of civilization, in
Okay.
this giant pile of books up to your hip, told in beautiful prose. That was a standard for American school books. It was a textbook essentially, used as a textbook for like 50 years. It was one of the most popular history books.
Right.
He was one of the most widely known popular history writers right up until like the 80s, I think, 80s and 90s. And
Mm-hmm.
now we don't know about him, you know?
Yeah.
And it's terrible. It's a terrible loss. Like, you know, I try to turn everybody onto him, and I never quite get. Everything's on YouTube. All of his stuff's up, recorded um, by one of the really great voice recording artists, audio book recording artists in the world. I mean, it's all there. I mean, hours of material of
Right.
just top-notch historical material.
Maybe this podcast will turn at least one person on to checking him out.
Yeah,
So yeah,
Bertrand
because
Russell, man.
I don't have a big audience, so
Will Durant.
there's 4 people listening here, probably.
Yeah.
No, you never know. You never know where
You
in the
never know.
future this goes. So
Yeah, you can turn one person on as well. You know, I mean, there's
yeah,
something.
well, the thing
Get to
is,
know what they'll
I
do.
did introduce you to Thomas Sowell, which maybe otherwise you wouldn't have never
Yeah.
heard because Thomas Sowell is not
Yep.
is somebody
Yep.
I love. I love Thomas
I'd have
Sowell.
never come across Thomas Sowell. Yeah, he's so cool, man. He's so nice. Yeah. Yeah, I love him. Like I
Because
said,
you first
I
listened
just
to
listened
the
to,
go on.
well, I said I just listened to his history of Marx, his recounting of the life of Marx. He doesn't like Marx. Not a big fan, but it was good, you know.
Well, apparently as a person he wasn't that great either. So that kind of translates to
Exactly. Yeah, he was pompous, man. Yeah.
do you know Jordan Peterson?
Hmm.
He has this
Yeah.
theory that that intellect and wisdom are not necessarily related. So somebody can be very high on intellect, but very
Mm.
low on wisdom, and the other way around. The other way around, the classic example that I would think is Forrest Gump. no intellect whatsoever, but very high.
Yeah, yeah,
You see, so but
yeah.
Thomas Sowell to me is somebody that's very high in intellect and very high in wisdom, and
Mm,
that's very rare because most intellectuals, like you said earlier, are aristocrats. They are from wealthy families. They never
that's
worked
it.
a dishwash or whatever. Never worked in a hostel a day in their
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
Never stayed in a hostel even. They don't know that life. You
yeah.
know.
Same with artists. Yeah, the turn off. Yeah.
You think same with postmodernist artists is the same?
I mean, being that most artists who come out of the art schools now are postmodernists, and most of them have gone to art school, meaning they took a degree that they didn't really care what it would do with with their life.
Right.
Uh,
What do
yeah,
you think is a
they're
solution?
rich.
What do you think? Do you think we should just ship some people off somewhere to work in a camp?
I think I would. Do you ever think about defunding education? What? Because I was always, again, being that I used to be, I'll finish quickly, that I
Yes.
used to be socialistically inclined. I always thought that free education was like the pathway to a successful society and all that sort of stuff. And then I started going to university, and I realized that it's the truth, or the education, the things that they're teaching you are so subjective that you're getting somebody's opinion largely, um, and a lot of it's wrong. I mean, a lot of them. I mean, I took a class that I thought would have no ideology in it whatsoever, and they taught us Marx as if it was the truth. It was
Which
crazy.
class? Which class?
It was a communications class. So I
Oh.
wanted to get into, yeah, I wanted to do journalism and stuff, but journalism doesn't exist as a degree anymore in New Zealand. You can't go out and take journalism. You got to
Why?
take communications. Because
Oh,
journalism
okay.
doesn't really exist as a job anymore in New Zealand.
Because
Yeah,
anybody can do it.
yeah,
You can just you can start this. You can do a
exactly.
video on YouTube,
Yeah,
and you could be a quote unquote journalist.
mm.
But you know
Yeah,
what?
but who's doing the research now,
Journalists have
Who's
become
learning to research carefully?
very partisan nowadays. It used to be they pretended to be objective maybe 10 years ago or whatever. But
Yeah.
now it's just like they're just like coming out with the question includes a statement like that's very partisan, and then it's
Mm.
if you take an example how they question Trump versus how they question Obama, like the this,
Loaded questions, eh? But it's the same, I thought it would be the same with education. I thought it was going to be objective and practical, and it was not
yeah.
objective and not very practical.
You
I
know
was really
what?
disappointed.
I've had an experience in the college where the professor of literature thought that critical theory, which for those of you who don't know, it's from cultural Marxism, who thought that critical theory was very handy and nice. And I was going out of my mind sometimes in that class because
Yeah, yeah.
if if you take critical theory, then any kind of a small story that's innocent you can turn into a victim perpetrator kind of
Oh yeah,
dynamic.
critical theory
And
is
then I'm
unbearable.
like, this is just a story about a boy and a girl. It's not about
Mm,
a
mm,
victim
mm.
perpetrator or
Yeah, and you look at where it was sort of founded off of. It was founded off of a lot of really poor quality, unobjective French philosophy, right? Like what's his name?
the
The dude with this
Frankfurt
word.
School, the Marcuse and all that.
Like yeah, like what's his name? Faux
Foucault,
Michel
Michel Foucault.
Michel Foucault. Yeah, Michel Foucault. Yeah,
Have
he's
you
a.
read any of his work?
I've not read him yet. I've watched. I really enjoyed. There's a debate between him and Noam Chomsky. That'll surprise you. Between him and Noam Chomsky, actually, um, and it's not a political debate. It's a debate mainly about human nature,
Hmm.
and it's just embarrassing. Like Noam Chomsky just wipes the floor with him. It's like, I mean, you really see him for he's a trumped up high school history teacher who's gone way above his head, and
Right.
now he's having to deal with a serious intellectual who, I mean, I have time for Mr. Noam, but he does get over the top.
I
But
mean,
he just got played. It's
I don't know.
embarrassing.
So Chomsky to me is not. I mean, his linguistic work maybe is has credibility,
You,
but his other work, I don't know. I
yeah,
don't
I
think.
know he's made errors. He's made errors with his political stuff, and people have called him out on it. But man, he knows his stuff when he starts talking about human nature because he approaches it from a scientific English style philosophical perspective, not this kind
Okay.
of ridiculous French way of looking at things where, they're like, his name, what am I thinking of? There's this kind of Freudian search into the hidden meaning of things, into the hidden meaning of words and the
Right.
implications that we don't know are there. And it's like, man, you're just making this up.
Oh,
There's no
Chomsky was
objective
saying you're just
background to
making
this.
this up.
Now, in this argument, it was more about human nature. And you
Okay.
have Foucault essentially saying there's no such thing as human nature because humans are totally malleable. That and there's then obviously an element of truth behind this, but
Right.
it's an element that's obvious and it doesn't almost need to be said. Yeah, okay, so you're telling me people have behaved differently throughout history depending on their context.
Sure.
Like, oh wow, that me, I never thought of that. Like obviously, but
Amazing.
but it but at the end of the day, we've had essentially the same needs, which create the same desires, which sort of propel our behavior. It's been the same more or less consistently. Noam goes into his lingual stuff and does some nice little explanations, and he's very sort of logical, scientific,
Right, right,
and
right.
rational. And then you just see Foucault just being like, "Oh, I don't know how to," he just gets slayed. His floor is wiped
Yeah,
clean.
but I would say that even though Chomsky appears to be very rational, I think his intellect is very high, but his wisdom,
Yeah,
his view on American foreign policy is absurdism from my view. It's like it's like
yeah.
you'd be better off painting, and you wouldn't
Yeah.
pollute minds of people. You
He likes looking for he likes looking for hypocrisy in the American in the way that America does things, doesn't he?
Right. Okay, so
Especially looking at
going back
mm,
to your question about uh, definancing some schools, I think
what do
the
you think?
social a lot of the new degrees um, that deal with the studying, let's say studying racism or studying anything like that. That's not
Mm,
that's maybe academically interesting, but it's not. You can't find a job with that. I think that, or
mm,
any kind of Marxism inspired. Like I would be more inclined to finance something that's like a trade school or a engineering kind of that mathematics, science, hard science,
mm,
even some psychology. I think maybe some of it is already contaminated by Marxism. I'm sure. Like you have Lacan and you have all the other stuff. So I don't know.
Immature
That's
looking.
maybe
Yeah,
that's a controversial statement, but
it
psychology is not
seems like the
science.
seems like the obvious thing to do would be to promote objective study fields of study, right? Anything that you can get a pretty clear, it's related to the material world, and you can get a pretty clear yes or no, and opinions don't enter into it. Uh,
Yeah. Okay.
those
I'll give
same
you an
jobs,
example.
those seem to
Sorry.
create real jobs as well. It seems to be.
Right. But this is the amount. This is how bad it's gotten, because even math now, some math teachers are saying that math, like 2 + 2 is 4. That's somehow male patriarchy. That's it's
Who's
kind of
saying that?
racism. There was a
Who's saying
professor
that?
that
I mean,
says there was you can always find a professor that would say something
yeah,
outlandish, and you
yeah,
can argue maybe it's because they want 5 minutes of fame, or maybe the
yeah,
serious part is they actually believe it. And this is
yeah,
somebody
yeah,
that knows math. So
yeah.
I'm like saying, even math is not safe from this contamination, that
Mm,
what hope is there for the rest of education?
mm. Yeah, I remember going to the class and the teacher coming up and being like, "Oh, what that was the professor." I remember he made the statement that and it's a morally like admirable idea, but you can tell he's not thinking clearly. He said, when, I remember in the middle of the thing, he said that he was talking about the history of kind of the history of journalism and what we think of as the I think it's the public sphere, you know,
Hmm.
the yeah, the central court, the place where the people are, where
Right.
people are able to interact and discuss things, and that got expanded into once we had the printing press, that got expanded into journals and magazines, and you know, and then now it's wider with the internet. So right at the beginning. I don't know how he managed to bring it up, but I remember him saying the phrase that race is a social construct. And I remember thinking, like, that's a perfectly admirable way to want to look at things. Like, sure, race means nothing. I mean, and we know pretty well now that after that whole bottleneck, you remember from history that the world population after the explosion of Mount Toba, in the Philippines or whatever, it was this giant eruption, and then something like 1% of human beings survived. There was like 10,000 or 20,000 people left afterwards.
Okay.
Tiny population of human beings, and they repopulated the earth, and that's why we have with really, really little genetic differences between different races. So it's a pretty negligible thing. But to say it's a social construct is to say that we've come up with them as a society for a function. And it's like, sorry, man, but like, me getting sunburnt all the time it's not a social construct. There's a physical occurrence that's happening, somebody
But
having a,
you have to be careful because this it might be hate speech what you're saying now.
yeah.
No, no, no. I'm
That's what I'm
saying
saying. It's
it's
kind of
the
different.
absurdity of it all because
Yeah, yeah,
anything you say, if you say even more controversial is if you say there is no that gender is a social construct, let's say, which some people I
yeah.
think are saying.
Yeah, if you have a physical appendage, it's not a social construct. Like, I mean, I don't know how you even argue that. And I think it shows the dishonesty for people. Some of the people in these professions, some of these people who are educators just don't. I mean, it's admirable that they prefer to to be or to appear morally nice
Right.
than to be truthful, but to me it's pretty disgusting. I mean, there's the truth and there isn't the truth. There's nothing immoral about the truth. It's just the truth.
Yeah.
And it exists to a certain extent. We all perceive things differently and blah blah blah, but essentially the thing, whatever we're all basically perceiving is the same way. If it's a material looking fact, then it's the truth. you know and we shouldn't have to morally pose like that just to try to
Yeah, it's assertions. It's people saying, "Well, this we believe to be true," and you cannot question it. And once you
mm,
start that, then it becomes a dogma. It becomes a
yeah,
dogma.
yeah, yeah,
It's same with Marxism. Yeah, if you
that's
say,
what it is now.
Marxism, that it killed many people, they will be like, well, no, no, that's actually not. It was not Marxism. It's not. They disassociate, disassociate,
Mm.
reject, because that doesn't. The discussion of that doesn't even enter because it's forbidden.
Mm. To me, the
So.
problem with, like, I still have, like, I've got socialist sympathies, but the problem with Marxism, which I think was pointed out pretty well by, like, Bertrand Russell, for example, who was also he was a socialist initially,
Mhm.
and but when you put and I'm sure there'd be a way to fix it as well, essentially. But this was pointed out during Marx's time by one of his compatriots. What was his name? He eventually became one of the most important anarchists. I forget his name at the moment, but he pointed this out then, and it totally came to fruition. It's like, if you put, all right, you have to have a damn good democracy to make it work. But if you're putting the legal system, pretty much everybody's property, meaning like private property becomes state property.
Mhm.
So if the private property is the property of the state, then you got to have a pretty serious democracy for that to actually belong to the people. The idea is that the state in a communist society is strictly the property. It's the people. The state and the people are the same thing. You
Right.
know,
Right.
so you need a serious democracy for that to function. So if you're going to say this land that is here belongs to all of the people, not just an individual person. And by doing that, you say it belongs to the state because the state is all of the people. Then you've got to have a serious democracy. And the problem is, if you put that much power, the um, the court system, private property, uh, the enforcers of law, the police, each regional government, if everything is in one single place under the government, which is supposed to be super democratic because it's the people, you're just creating a situation for a dictator to spring up.
Mhm.
Whoever is elected as the representative, or a group of people who are elected as representatives, given them that much power and that much control, it's one, really unlikely they're going to say at the end, well, I'm done with this now, no problem, next person's turn. And two, it's very easy for them to just snap down and start creating complete control, which has happened every single time we've had a communist attempted a system.
Right. And then they benefit themselves by taking, uh, having mansions and having a lot of wealth
Yeah.
compared to the rest. So then you have a few people at the
Yeah.
top, and then the general people are like
Yeah.
at the bottom.
And that happened in Russia immediately with Lenin, who completely centralized power and didn't give it up, and said, no, we're doing this temporarily because it's a dangerous situation at the moment, which
Right.
happens sometimes even in real democracies. I think that was the old word for a tyranny. Tyranny was in ancient Greece. During times of war, the Athenian democracy would elect a tyrant who
Mm-hmm.
would take complete control of the state for a period of time and then give it back to the people. Um, but there were measures, and it usually did come back to the people because the people were used to democracy and they didn't want a tyrant. They hated kings and tyrants, but they suffered it necessarily. Lenin did the same thing initially, and then, like, what we all saw what happened with that. It's not to say that there isn't a way to separate the powers within a communistic system, but pretty quickly, yeah, and it just hasn't been done yet. I think it's the wrong starting place for it.
I think the only place socialism can work is maybe in a small community where everybody is quote unquote good. Because the problem is, and the simplest I can say is the syndrome of not washing the dishes. Like you lived in hostels and you've seen, but also
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
also this applies to
It's,
apartments. Let's say you have 5 people in an apartment and you live together, and there'll always be one person that doesn't do the dishes or whatever, or doesn't clean or whatever you have. So put this on a large scale. If you don't have any punishments and people can do their job without being checked or without any accountability, then you might have a city where people, the rubbish people, are not picking up the trash, or you might have chaos quickly, and then you have to impose punishment. So you have
accountability. Yeah,
accountability.
yeah, totally.
Whereas if you
Escape
have a
accountability
job,
so easily.
if you're paid
Yeah.
and you're paid on, I guess I could argue that if somebody in a communist system, what would be the penalty? What would be the penalty is, well, we give you a stern talking to, you have to do your job. Everybody's paid the same, or everybody's got the same. If it's
Mm.
money, it's the same kind of rations, or the same, about the same apartment, or you get the same. But then if you don't do, what would be the consequences? Do the police come and take you away? Do,
I
do
think it.
do they
I think it
re-educate
depends.
you?
Eh? I'm sure. I'm sure in Stalinist Russia, you were pretty well just shot if you didn't do what you're supposed to do. But
Right.
it's not just that. It's also like you know, if you're the type of person who's figured out how to make a lot of money, we should probably be, or you found a way to organize a group of people, for example, in a way that's more efficient than the way other people are organizing their groups of people, then we should probably allocate you more resources so you can keep doing it on a larger scale because you're making things more efficient.
But
So it's
that's
a bit
it.
of a
That's business. That's
self-promoting
business.
system,
That's business.
isn't
If
it?
somebody has a business that is way cheaper than another business, like makes pencils that are way cheaper or whatever, then that business is gonna get more resources by virtue of people more having paying more money to, or buying more of their stuff. So actually, in
But
a capitalist system, that happens like kind of organically.
yeah, yeah, but also in a capitalist system, it runs away from you, and you start creating an 1840s situation where it's like, well, what's the easiest way for us to produce the most bricks? Well, if we pay everybody 5 cents per hour and make them live in the factory, then that's going to create the cheapest bricks, and we'll be the best competitors. So
Sure.
thus you get that's the statist argument that comes in where you start saying, okay, so this is why I say centrism, because somewhere in the middle is the right thing to do.
Well, you have to have protections for the worker. I totally agree with that. Yeah, but I
The
would say that capitalism,
regulation.
right, at its best, capitalism destroys communism. I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, yeah. You ask the fucking Uyghurs in China.
Oh yeah. Well,
Just,
that's
yeah, you know about
that's
what's happening in
religious
China?
kind of. That's a
Oh,
religious. They are. Is that the Muslims that they're?
it, it's a
Uh,
status thing, really. I don't think it has much to do with religions. I think the worrying thing about what's happening in China is that it's coming with statism, being like, if you think of you can think of politics on like whatever spectrum you want, like the left and right spectrum has all of these. It's vague, right? It's got all these little things tied up to it. It is to an extent. Well, it's not even to an extent statist versus non-statist. If you go far to the left, you end up with communist, which is a
mhm,
system which says that the states, or extreme socialist, which would say that the states dominate everything. You go to the far right, you get something like a dictatorship, which is again saying that the state should control as much as they can.
mhm.
So
They're very close
what
in a
the
way.
left, yeah, they kind of come around, but they also don't. What you just have is with left and right, you have a very untidy set of of values which have more to do with two different ways of looking at the world in terms of safety and control against open societies and equality.
Mhm.
Um, so it's almost like two sides of the brain fighting between left and right, but it's not really a clear. It's not really like a clear set uh, of rules or anything that dictate what's left versus what's right. There's a lot. It's like a little package, very
Yeah.
vague. So then you could also look at it as like there's a whole bunch of different spectrums that you can look at. One really nice tidy one is just statism versus non-statism. So if you have a status versus non-status spectrum, you'd say on the far right, at the statist side, you'd have both far right and far left,
Mhm.
because you would have communists or who would say that everything should be under the control of one leader or the government or the leader of a government that's right wing or whatever. And then going right to the left, you would have people who would be something like anarchists, but not like proper anarchists. There'd be people who say the state basically has no function and we don't need it.
Mhm.
And then in the middle, you'd probably, let's say if we're somewhere in the middle now, so we're quite statist. Most Western countries are quite statist now. A libertarian would be somewhere towards the lesser statist side, who would say, yeah, we want government, but we want small government.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's a useful spectrum. To me, what's happening in China is relating to a very, very hardcore statist uh, state, which is saying that they want complete control over their people, or as much control as they can. They think that the state has the right to control the media, and now they think that the state, to create a really strong state, it'd be really nice to have to be racially homogenous. They want to just be Han Chinese, right?
Mhm.
That's what they're going towards, I suspect. And I suspect they're trying to punish anybody who's not Han Chinese, trying to keep them from having so many babies.
Right, right.
So yeah, so that especially and that's why it's happening, especially in the regions that they've taken over in the last 50 years or so. It's happening especially in the West, because those are regions that aren't really, I mean, it's not really China. Those are different
Right. They want
cultures.
to have more compliance, more conformity. So that's the way they feel that they can do that.
Mm-hmm. It's exactly what I mean, I hate to make the Nazi comparison, but it's exactly what the Nazis did. They didn't the whole scapegoat this people, that people, they hated everybody and it's horrible. But the idea behind that was essentially because Nazis were super statists, and the best and to have a state which is racially homogenous,
Mhm.
it's easier to control that state. It's a status thing. It's disgusting, and it's terrifying. I think it's got to be one of the most terrifying things happening, and maybe the
Yeah.
worst thing that's
And
happening right now. It's horrible.
China is also taking over Hong Kong and making it
Yeah,
more like China, rather than the way it was before. Um,
yeah, yeah, and they're
but
cool. Like the Hong Kong people from Hong Kong are freedom-loving people.
yeah,
It's
but
it's
they're
terrible.
clamping down, and also the agreement was to expire. The two-state solution, I think, was to expire in 2041 anyway. So
Mm.
it's bound to. I feared that this was going to happen in the future, but it looks like they're clamping down now
Mm.
because
Mm.
because I think the reasoning behind it is if you leave in freedom for too long, then it's gonna be harder and harder to clamp down. So now they
Yeah.
see the opportunity with the virus, and now they
Mm.
clamping
Mm.
clamping down hard and
It is the case though, isn't it? Like once once a country or a group of people or a culture has democracy, they sort of seem to take a while to settle in. And then
Mm-hmm.
once they have it and once it's established, it's very hard to take from them. Like
Hopefully.
it'd be damn hard to take democracy away from most of the Western countries now. There's a tradition of it. There's a proud tradition of democracy. It's ingrained in the way of people's identities. It's ingrained in the identity of the nation. The
Right.
same thing for the countries that lost it. And again, it's hard, I hate to use the Nazi comparison, but with Germany at that time, they had a newly formed democracy, and a newly formed democracy tumbles much more easily.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you're right. Maybe they didn't want to have them get too used to this sort of democracy that they had.
Yeah, but it's also like I think democracy can fall, and that's what I kind of was seeing now with a lot of things that are happening in the world. That there's elements in the world that are very left, I think, and they want to take control of countries. Like if you look at the wiretapping that happened, apparently that happened on the still under the Obama administration, the wiretapping of Trump. That's
Well, they tapped Trump,
apparently. So that's very
apparently, according to
concerning. That's
Trump.
very concerning because it's like, um, anyway, I think we're gonna. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. I don't want to go down
Yeah,
into that. I
yeah,
would
yeah, yeah.
say that's speculation, maybe, and we'll see. We'll see what happens with the investigation because it's an ongoing thing in U.S. Um, but yeah, this is yeah, it's been almost like an hour. It went by pretty quickly, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah. Once you get going, it's quite fun, isn't it?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
do you have any social media or anything that people or do you want to just stay? I'm just using Cameron as your name, unless you want me to.
yeah. Um, yeah. I write books. Um, I have a, I have a, I don't know. I don't actually really have a way of organizing myself with the books particularly yet. But if you search my name on Amazon or in Google, you can find my books as I write them. I have one out so far. It's fiction at this point.
Oh,
I'm
you
writing
have one
nonfiction.
out. I didn't know that. I
Yep.
didn't know that.
Yeah, I have a book out. Yeah, I released a book in February. My
Okay,
first
what's the
book.
title and tell the audience so they catch
It's
it.
called It's All Over Now. It's called It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. Uh, and it's a novella and 3 short stories. And then
Okay.
I'm following up pretty soon with the next novel. So we'll
Okay.
keep track of it.
All right. I'll put the link in my when I post this on YouTube. I'll put the link to your book. So maybe
Cool.
somebody
Thank
will
you.
buy it. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And your name, your full name, I can use that as well, or do you want
yeah.
me to?
Yep.
Okay.
Cameron Churchill.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks.
And
Good
yeah,
fun.
thanks to the audience for listening or watching,
Thanks.
whatever.
I look forward to seeing more of your podcast, man.
Thank you.